Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm going to be addressing some common stereotypes that I hear about middle grade books and recommending books to kind of combat those. Basically the point of this video is I believe that there is a middle grade book out there for everybody, for every reader. Specifically this is going to be directed at adult readers, people who think that they're too old for middle grade or for whatever reason they think that it's not for them. And I'm going to be talking about why I really don't think that's true. In general, I have very few, if any, universal book recommendations. So instead I'm going to be very specific with these about, like I said, specific reasons that I have either seen or heard people say about why they've given up on middle grade, or they just they don't even want to try because they don't think it's for them. So this is something I've been thinking about doing for a while, and I thought with Middle Grade March coming up, possibly has already started by the time I'm posting this, I thought this was a great time to do it. I'm obviously very passionate about middle grade books and their quality. I think they have so many amazing stories out there. I have found many that I love, and I'm very passionate about this topic, obviously, and I want everybody to know that it's out there. Like, there is something out there for them, no matter your reading taste. So before I get into the specific recommendations, I think there are a few reasons why people tend to think that middle grade is not for them, and it's not all their fault. I mean, I think there unfortunately are some people out there who come at it from kind of a book snobbery perspective, like they're too good for middle grade, or they're too mature, like they're too intelligent. And that is really frustrating. But I think a lot of it is just like the way that the publishing industry is structured, because I think publishing is one of the reasons we have this kind of intense fixation on age ranges. By the way, middle grade is an age range, it's not a genre, just so that's on the record. But I think that is why we have this idea that age range is so important and so restrictive, and that you can never read outside of your target demographic. And I can understand to an extent why they do that. I mean, they're trying to target their books very particularly. They want to show it to people who they think it's going to be the easiest to sell. So I understand it, but it is kind of frustrating because then I think people get this idea that middle grade is only for middle grade readers, or, it's only for people who work with kids, which is very important. Like, I don't want to say that middle grade is written for adults, because it's not. Like, kids should have their own stories, and if a book doesn't work for an adult but it works for a kid, it is still just as valuable as if it were one that appeals to multiple ages. But the focus of this video is going to be that adults can read it too, so that's what I'm going to talk about. And then the other reason is that I think a lot of people kind of stay away from it is that it can take just as much work as figuring out your taste in anything else. I think one of the harmful things about thinking middle grade is a genre is that people think if they try a couple middle grade books and don't like them, they can just write off the entire age range, and that's not true. Think about when you were getting into reading, or when you were first getting into a genre that you never used to like. If you're lucky, you can find something right away that fits your niche, and then you can kind of start pursuing that more. But sometimes it takes a really, really long time. Like, I know when I finally started enjoying magical realism and fabulism, it took years for me to figure out that I can actually like it and what kinds I can actually enjoy. So depending on the reader and their experience and what kind of book they're looking at, it's not necessarily going to be like the first book you pick up is a huge success for you, which can be disappointing, but don't let that put you off. So to sum up this introductory part, when I hear people say that they don't like middle grade at all, to me it's almost like saying, I don't like books with red covers. That's kind of what it feels like, because it's like something that has absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the story or even the kind of story. All that means is that of the books you've tried for middle grade, you've not happened to find one you enjoy yet. I've actually done a couple discussion videos on this before, how I think that a lot of the ways people assume that we can differentiate middle grade from other fiction, those don't actually hold up, or they're not very useful. You can have all kinds of genres, all kinds of writing styles, all kinds of characters. Like, there's so much variety there. Okay, so finally getting into the recommendations part, the first stereotype, or the first reason that I hear people give, is they don't like the writing of middle grade books. They say that it's too simplistic and they don't enjoy it. So I'm going to recommend a few middle grade books that I think have absolutely stellar writing style, some of them for different reasons. The first one is an old favorite of mine, Frances Hardinge. I talk about her all the time. I actually have a full recommendation video on her books, but she just has this incredible way with description and figurative language that doesn't overpower the story. Her settings are just fantastically described. Her characters, like, she's so good at sketching side characters in just a few well-chosen words, and also really, really well developing her main cast. Like I've said before, she has this way of describing things where you never would have thought to put those words together for this kind of thing, but the instant you hear them, it makes sense to you. I just think she is a fantastic wordsmith, and I highly recommend any of her books. The next one is Lalani of the Distant Sea by Erin and Entrada Kelly. This is a book that has a very kind of soft lyricism to the writing. It's not overly poetic and flowery, and so this might be one that, depending on your preferences, you might still consider this one too simplistic, but I don't think it is. It has this really beautiful poetry to it. There are even sections throughout this book that are told in like an old fairy tale kind of style, a very sinister kind of fairy tale style, but I just think that the style of this one is very different from the straightforwardness that people tend to associate with middle grade books. Again, there's a wonderful main character, and that book is just a really wonderful exploration of responsibility and revenge and family and friendship. It's really lovely to see Lalani, the main character, become sure of herself and to realize that she is a good person and she is a brave person, even if she's not as brash and outgoing as her best friend or other characters are. Next, I have The Lost Frost Girl by Amy Wilson, and this one I specifically included on this list because in addition to having, I think, a really lovely grasp of atmosphere and descriptions, which are something that I can feel are overdone often. So a lot of my favorite writers are ones that I think do a good job with description without making it feel like it's bogging down the story. But besides that, the reason I wanted to include The Lost Frost Girl on this list is because I think another assumption people have about middle grade is not only that the writing is very plain, but also that it all sounds the same and that there's not a lot of differentiation between their narration or the main characters. And I think The Lost Frost Girl is a great example of how there is just as much variation in characters as in young adult or any other kind of book you could name. Owl, our protagonist, finds out that she is the daughter of Jack Frost, and the way she handles these things I think is very believable. The way she tries to balance her real world issues with this kind of supernatural or magical mystery that she's dealing with. It all felt very true. It felt like both sides of that conflict were important to her, and just her narrative voice was, I think, so fun. Like, she's a very clever and spunky character, but she cares about things. Like, she doesn't bury everything under a joke, you know. You really feel her connection to her family and her loneliness. And another thing worth mentioning is this is told in, I think, first person present tense, which is my least favorite combination for point of view, and I think the one that is hardest to get right. And so I think the fact that this one made such a good impression on me is extra impressive for that reason. And last in this category, I have a couple of novels in verse, and these are for a reason that is, like, this is quite literally a different kind of writing than I think people associate with middle grade. I have Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga, which is a contemporary novel, and I actually specifically mentioned this one as if you don't really get along with novels in verse or you're not really sure about them, I think this could be a great one to start with. I actually listened to this one on audio, and it just read like a very lyrical and beautifully written contemporary rather than a novel in verse, so I think that might be a nice way to ease into that if you're interested. And it's a fantastic story about our main character Juda, who's forced to leave Syria and go and stay with some American family members. Her and her mother leave Syria together to stay with them, and it's about her adjusting to her new life and trying to make friends, and she starts learning English, she starts trying to fit in while also missing her homeland and missing the people that she left behind. It's just a beautiful exploration of immigration and family and hope and war. It does so many things so well, and the writing is definitely another strength. And the other one is A Time to Dance by Padma Venkatraman. I think this might actually be the first novel in verse I ever read. I first read this many, many years ago. And this one is, I think, a little more straightforward. So again, if you're somebody who you only like flowery writing, this one might not work for you. You might want to go for one of the other ones in this category. This is about our main character who lives in India, and she is a dancer, and it is very important to her. And right at the beginning of the book, she actually gets in an accident, and I think one of her legs has to be amputated at the knee or around the knee. And she's devastated because she can't do what brought her so much joy. And so the book is about her realizing that her body is still beautiful and it can still do the things that she loves. It's about her relearning dance, relearning kind of life in general. It sounds very dramatic, but really that's what happens, is she has to look at things in a different way, and she's really angry about things, understandably, at the beginning of the book. But I think it's done in a good way because you really see her start to love the body that she has now. I just think that's a fantastic book. So the next reason that I have heard is that all the stories are the same. This idea that all middle grade books sound alike or are alike. And to this, I have to say genres. Like, genres are your friend. Middle grade is not a genre, like I said at the beginning, it's an age range. So this is really about you settling in on what kinds of stories you like to read in other age ranges. I think a lot of times the genre people tend to associate with middle grade is fantasy, and specifically a very particular kind of whimsical fantasy, which I really enjoy sometimes, but I understand that, you know, you might want something different. I think when you're getting into a new genre or subgenre or age range or any kind of book, I think it can be tempting to just look at the like best of lists or like, you know, 20 best like science fiction novels if you're trying to get into sci-fi. And I understand that impulse, but I think that's for me at least, that's been a really bad way to try and figure out what I like. I tried to do that when I got into science fiction, and I hated almost everything I read. And it took me realizing, like, oh, I still have to pay attention to my taste in books and what I enjoy and what I want to find in the science fiction context. So I think that's another thing that could help the, like, all the stories sound the same thing. I think a lot of the ones that the publishers really push have a very similar, not a very similar tone, but I think sometimes they will go for a particular, like, brand almost of their titles, like trying to kind of link them together. So I think when you're just trying to get into something, it's a good idea to try lots of different things, to think about what you personally like and not to rely too heavily on like what's most popular or, you know, what people say is like the best of a genre, because chances are if you've been having trouble getting into it, maybe it's because you don't really align with the current trend in that genre or age range or whatever it is. So think about what genres you like in other age ranges. Like if you really like adult thrillers or mysteries, there are some middle grade mysteries out there that are really excellent. One of the ones I want to mention is Greenglass House by Kate Milford. I really enjoyed the mystery aspects of that book, and our main character Milo is also adopted, so there's some really wonderful discussion of that. His friendship with a girl named Medi is really lovely. Like seeing them finally start to work together is very satisfying, and I just love the imagination of this book that also felt very grounded in well-developed characters. There's also middle grade nonfiction, which I think a lot of people don't know about, like Rejected Princesses by Jason Porath. Basically, interesting women from history who are too violent or too weird or too controversial that to ever become like Disney princess types is kind of the story behind the name. And there's a wonderful variety there from lots of different cultures and backgrounds, many different kinds of women, many different kinds of strength, and some of them are not good people. Like the book is not saying we should admire these women just because they're women, but the book is saying that these are important historical figures and we would have learned about them if they were men, which I think is a really important distinction to make. The illustrations are also beautiful. I think the tone of the writing is definitely appropriate for kids, but I read it as an adult and really enjoyed it. Some of it is very tongue-in-cheek and humorous, but I think he also did a good job of talking about the serious parts in a serious way, because that's something that can kind of frustrate me, is when a book that is a true story or based on true stories is written in a way that's like so flippant that you almost feel like they don't care about the serious things they're talking about, and this book didn't do that. There's also ratings for each story about like how violent or upsetting they would be, so if you are reading this to a child, you can kind of decide how old they are and what would be appropriate for them. There's just a lot of great things about that book. Also, if you are more into classics and maybe a little bit of science fiction, Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pierce is absolutely wonderful. This is a book where the time travel is very important, but how it works is not. So if you like kind of soft sci-fi, which is kind of what I tend to enjoy, I think this would be a fantastic book for you. The writing is also fantastic. It's very clever and wry, and it's a really subtle humor. I think what people tend to associate with like British humor, that's what it feels like to me, and Tom as a main character is just so wonderful. He's that perfect balance of a middle grade protagonist where he feels very believable as a kid, but he's also written in such a way that adults can connect to him and enjoy his character, and in a way that shows that kids have just as much a variety of personalities as older people do. And this book also gets kind of serious in some places, which is another thing I love about middle grade, is that it can be fun or beautiful, and also deal with some really heavy themes. This one is not as overt, I think, as some of the others I'm going to talk about. But when Tom first gets sent back to this garden, he starts exploring, he meets a friend, he has like this wonderful time, he wants to stay there forever. But then there's like this bittersweet quality to it, because the whole time you're reading, you know that something's going to have to change because he can't stay in this past garden forever. And I think that bittersweetness is what really made this book a favorite for me, because it all feels so real. Like you're right there with Tom as he's trying desperately to figure out a way that he can have things both ways, that he can continue to go back in time and to live in this idyllic garden setting with his friend, and also stay at home with the people that he knows and his family. I just thought that was beautifully done. And then the other one I want to mention, this is just like a sampling of genres, there are obviously many more genres I could talk about, is Midsummer's Mayhem by Rajani LaRocca. And this is interesting. It's like kind of soft fantasy, I think. It's mainly a contemporary, but I wouldn't call it fabulism exactly, so I guess it's kind of contemporary fantasy, and it's actually a Shakespeare retelling. It's a retelling of A Midsummer Night's Dream. This book is also Own Voices for the Indian American representation, and our main character Mimi, she's a baker, that's what she loves to do, and she enters the competition, and because this is A Midsummer Night's Dream retelling, some fairy mayhem and mischief gets mixed up in that. And so there's baking magic, which is something I really enjoy. And while all of this conflict is going on, it also really showcases Mimi's family relationships and her friendships. Like, she's dealing with a friend who has moved away, which is really hard for her. And you really see how her siblings' personalities, how those affect her and like her place in her family. I just think this is a really great book for showing the way that being a sibling changes your perspective on your family, and it changes how you fit into your family, and that's not a bad thing. But I just think it's done in a really thoughtful way in this book, and this one I think is noteworthy because even though some parts of this book are what people tend to associate with middle grade, I think the fact that it's a Shakespeare retelling is something that might surprise people. I think sometimes people who don't read middle grade don't think about not only does middle grade have a lot of genres, but it has a lot of subgenres too, like retellings. And I also love Shakespeare, so this one was really fun for me. The next reason I've heard is that middle grade is too whimsical, that people don't like that kind of thing, and all middle grade is whimsical, so they don't want to read middle grade. And this is kind of related to the genre issue that I was talking about before. But basically, if that's your reason you don't like middle grade, I think a good solution for you would be to seek out genres that are more grounded. So contemporaries, there's a lot of wonderful middle grade contemporaries out there, and historical fiction is another great one. So just maybe don't try fantasy and sci-fi for a while. Try a different kind of middle grade. And I have a few recommendations here as well, of course. The first one is More to the Story by Hena Khan. And speaking of retellings, this is a Little Women retelling that I actually loved quite a bit more than the original. I love classics, but Little Women is not one of my favorites. And it's really wonderful how seamlessly Hena Khan translated that classic story to a middle grade contemporary. Like the parallels that she draws, like father, rather than fighting in the Civil War, gets a job halfway across the world, so their family feels really separated from him. And Jamila, rather than being an aspiring author, she works at her school newspaper and she wants to become like the head editor of the newspaper. And I think one of the strongest signs that this book is well done is I know the story of Little Women, and I still was upset and surprised at certain developments that happen in this book. Like, Jamila really deals with a lot. Her and her whole family. One of her sisters gets sick. I also think it's a really, really thoughtful portrayal of kids at that age, like around 12 or 13, I think is how old Jamila is. And that weird phase where you're friends with guys, but you're starting to think of them as being more than friends. I just thought that was really well done, and it doesn't take over the story by any means, but I think sometimes there are some middle grade authors who I feel like aren't as good at portraying that. Like, it feels kind of weird, and it never felt weird in this book. I also want to mention her book Amina's Voice. That one deals with Islamophobia specifically. Our main character Amina wanting to be a part of this American culture while also holding on to her family's background. And then after her local mosque is vandalized, these things get thrown into even sharper relief. It was unfortunately a very topical story. It goes with a lot of very serious real world issues. I do want to mention, I think that one is written a little younger than More to the Story, so if you're just getting into middle grade, maybe it'd be better to start with a different one just because, you know, you don't want to be put off by the younger tone, if that is something that bothers you. Another wonderful contemporary is I Can Make This Promise by Christine Day, and this is another book that handles really heavy and topical issues. I would definitely be careful going into this one. If certain content or trigger warnings bother you, specifically related to families and adoption, I will list those content warnings in the description box if you're interested. But this one can get incredibly heavy at times, but I think it deals with it in a really appropriate and thoughtful way. I really loved our main character, and something I loved about this book, and that I often love with middle grade that deals with serious topics, is even though there's this really upsetting like main plot that is happening, there's also smaller conflicts, and those are not made to feel meaningless. Like, while all of this is going on, our main character is also dealing with a really upsetting friend breakup, and I think as anybody who has been through a friend breakup knows, those can be devastating. And even though she knows that she has this much more serious issue going on, the book is not written in a way that makes you feel like her hurt from her friendship that is dissolving. It's not written in a way that makes it feel like that doesn't count. And that's something I appreciate in all age ranges, honestly. Just because something is not the biggest conflict doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you. And I thought that was beautifully done here. This is also a book about Native American culture and identity. And like I said, lots of content warnings with this one, but just done in a beautiful and very sensitive way, and in a way that there is a spark of hope in this book, which is pretty amazing considering the content. If you're leaning more towards historical fiction, I want to mention The Making of Molly by Anna Carey. This is set in Ireland at the time when women were campaigning for the vote, and our main character, Molly, is just so much fun. I think this is another kind of good bridge book for middle grade because I don't actually remember the age of the main character, but because it's set in a certain time period, I think she feels a little older than kids of her age would today. So if you are still getting used to middle grade books and younger protagonists, this might be kind of a good bridge into that. I really loved seeing Molly start to get involved in the movement and stand up for herself. I think this book deals with important issues, obviously, like the right to vote, but this one with a little bit lighter touch, I think. This one isn't quite as heavy as some of the other ones I've been discussing, so that might also be something to keep in mind. If you don't want to read something that's incredibly serious or possibly upsetting, then this might be a good bet for that. Now, even though this is the like not whimsical category, I do want to mention In Darkling Wood by Emma Carroll, and this one, it is a little bit whimsical because there is a plot line related to fairies in the wood, but the main part of this story is completely grounded in the real world, despite the fact that there are magical creatures. And that's because our main character Alice, her younger brother Theo, right at the beginning of the book, he gets approved for a heart transplant. Like he's been sick for a long time, and his family, they finally are thinking that he'll be okay, and he doesn't get better as quickly as he should, and they start getting worried. So Alice is incredibly worried about her brother, and then on top of this, she's actually not even allowed to be with him. She gets sent off to stay with her grandmother, who she's never met, who is not exactly thrilled to have her there, and that's where she finds the wood in her backyard that has these fairies. But she doesn't believe in the fairies, of course, for a really long time. And gradually Alice starts wondering if her brother's life and health could somehow be connected to this wood, and if she can help save the wood, like to stop it from getting chopped down like her grandmother wants to, if she can rescue the wood, maybe it'll rescue her brother too. And then in addition to that, we also get chapters that are from, I think, the First World War, that are told from letters that a young girl is writing to her brother at the front. And so you also get this historical fiction aspect that I think was really well done. And just all of this book feels very immediate in the emotional stakes. And like I said, despite there being fairies and there being that whimsical touch, for one thing, Alice is not really into that stuff. So it feels like a very like real world kind of book. And also I think the main conflict, even though there are fairies involved in it, it's about family, and it's about being worried for people you care about. It's about responsibility. It's about things like war. So there's a lot of other things going on besides that fairy plot line. So the next reason I've heard is that people like to read about serious issues, that basically middle grade books aren't important enough, or they don't go far enough. And I actually have, you probably noticed, mentioned several books already that definitely disprove that. I Can Make This Promise being one of them, and Amina's Voice being another. But I also want to mention a few others here, and the first one is the Time series by Megan Morrison. I actually have a full spoiler-free review on that series, which I will link down below. And this one is kind of a middle grade / YA series. Like, I don't know exactly how people would categorize this one, which also makes it a really good option for a bridge book for getting into younger age ranges. And this is just such a fantastic fantasy series. One of the things I love about it most is the way that Megan Morrison can take real world issues and blend them with this fantasy setting, and it feels seamless. Like the first book deals with toxic relationships, the second one deals with workplace unions and fair work practices, the third one deals with politics and like GMOs, and specifically democracy. There's also a murder mystery kind of plot that's happening. Like each book deals with some really serious issues, but in a way that doesn't ever feel heavy-handed, and that it feels very woven into this fantasy world. She takes these fairy tale or fantasy tropes and she kind of takes them to their logical conclusion. Like in the second book, like what would it mean if people are like going out in these beautiful ball gowns every night? Like how would you like to be one of the seamstresses forced to work on those, you know, hours and hours on end, that kind of thing. And I just think that she is so thoughtful with her books, and the world building is really great too. I think something that puts people off this series, which I've talked about before, is the first one, Grounded, The Trials of Rapunzel. By the way, each of them retells a different fairy tale, which is also done really well. But the first book, Rapunzel is a very frustrating main character. She's incredibly sheltered. She's been kept in a tower her whole life, so she knows nothing about how the world works. And she can be very naive and rude, but she has such a wonderful arc. So I think if you can stick it out to the end of the book, it is so worth it. Like I know a lot of people DNF'd it early on, and that makes me really sad because it's a fantastic series and you see her grow in such a believable way. Like everything, like all of her growth feels earned, and that goes for all of the characters. And I think another reason people maybe don't give a series a chance is because at the very beginning it feels like a very standard fairy tale world. Like there's fairies and like the different regions have kind of cutesy names based on colors and things like that, but that's very deliberate because you're kind of lulled into thinking it's going to be this like sugary sweet world, and then you start seeing all the problems with it. And I think that is done in a really, really impressive way. It just makes me sad that people don't stick around to see it. So if you do try that series, which I highly recommend, please at least give the first book a full try because I just think it is so, so worth it. Next in this category, I have two books to recommend by Pam Muñoz Ryan. I definitely want to read more of hers, but these are the two I've read so far. The first one is Esperanza Rising, and this one, our main character Esperanza, she's forced to flee her town in Mexico. She was very well off originally, and her mother are forced to flee to California. I forget what year this is, but it's like right around the time that the Californian, like the field workers movement was like getting started, because they have really awful conditions. So this book really deals with immigration, again with workplace practices. It deals with colorism quite a bit. The family relationships in this book are done so well. Like the bond between Esperanza and her mother, and Esperanza and her grandmother, and like her mother with her grandmother. All of these family bonds are so important, and I think they're described so beautifully, and for a relatively short book, I think you get a really clear picture of these characters and of how they connect to each other. Esperanza also has a very serious character arc to go through, because she starts out very spoiled, thinking she's better than everyone, and you see her realize that she's not, and that she's not actually a bad person. She's just been kind of raised to not show the good parts of herself, if that makes sense. And you see that underneath that she does have compassion, and she's just never nurtured it. And then her other novel that I've read is Becoming Naomi León, and this is a contemporary. Esperanza Rising was historical fiction, and our main character is Naomi. Naomi and her younger brother live with their great-grandma, I think, and they love it there. They're happy with her. Her younger brother Owen, I forget if he has I think he has a physical disability, which means that a lot of people don't treat him very well. And then one day, Naomi and Owen's mother comes back, and she says she's going to take them away from the great-grandmother, that she's ready to be an active part of their lives again. And that's kind of where the conflict starts, because Naomi doesn't want to go with her. She's happy where she is. She doesn't really think her mom is going to do a good job of taking care of them. And the book is about Naomi finding her voice and standing up for what she wants and for what is right and for the people that she cares about. They also end up trying to find their father because they kind of lost contact with him. There's kind of this like quest element almost too, and this is just such a lovely and important book, and there are certain scenes in this book that still just like get me when I think about them now. I actually reread this one relatively recently, and it's still just as powerful as an adult, if not more so, because I can see and appreciate certain connections that I'm not sure I would have picked up on. Also, again, I will list content warnings down below, but I remember there's some child abuse and alcoholism in this book as well. Next, I have The Dollmaker of Kraków by R.M. Romero, and this is another historical fiction book, and this one actually blends a little bit of a fantasy element as well. And we have kind of several main characters, but one of them is Carolina, and she kind of gets magically transported from the land of dolls into the workshop. This book is set in Poland right around the time of World War II, and Carolina and the dollmaker, and they get involved in protecting some Jewish friends of theirs from the rapidly increasing danger that they're facing. And this book is so incredibly heavy and upsetting. I read this one a couple years ago, and that's at a point when I had been reading and loving middle grade for a long time and appreciating that middle grade can handle really serious issues. And despite all that, I was still surprised, shocked even, at how heavy and serious and unflinching this book got. So this is definitely on the heavier side of the books I'm going to talk about today, because it obviously deals with World War II and the Holocaust. I think the way that R.M. Romero used a fantasy or fairy tale parallel world to mirror our world and what was happening, I think that was very clever. Like when Carolina leaves the land of the dolls, her country is war-torn too, and so she's really noticing the differences but the many similarities between the world she left and the world that she finds. I also want to talk about The Lost Princess of Bamarre by Gail Carson Levine. This is a prequel to The Two Princesses of Bamarre, which is my favorite book by that author, and I was really nervous about this one because, you know, prequels are sometimes not great, but this was so good, because I think if you love the original story, it's different enough from The Two Princesses that I wasn't like constantly comparing the two. But you also pick up on these Easter eggs where if you do love the original, it's really fun to read this story. And I also think if you don't like Two Princesses, like the story and the characters and the premise, even the setting is different enough that it feels like if you want to separate it from Two Princesses, you can. So just like all around a really great concept for a prequel. And this one deals with some unexpectedly serious things. Our main character Peregrine, she all her life has believed that she is a Lakti, who are kind of the invading, conquering forces who took over Bamarre. They're the colonizers, basically. And she finds out one day that she's actually a Bamarre by birth. And those are the ones that the Lakti have subjugated. They're looked down on as being weak and cowardly and all of this. So Peregrine has to face the fact that she is one of this group of people who she has looked down on all her life, who she has been raised to look down on. And the way her arc is done is just really thoughtful and really well done, because it's not framed in a way where like, oh, Peregrine realizes this is bad because now she's getting treated badly. Like, the book is very clear that she should have had a problem with their treatment before she even found out she was one of them. And I think that is a really important thing to get across, and I was really happy with the way the book did that. There's also some really great character work in this book. Like, besides Peregrine's arc, the family relationships are so interesting. There's a slight romance plot that is really, really sweet, and just the overall story of Peregrine realizing who she is in more ways than one, like realizing that it's up to her to stand up to the Lochte, and she's going to lead the people of Bamarre to try and get their country back. It's just so inspiring and so powerful, and highly recommend that one. And then the last book in the serious issues category, even though I have many I could talk about, is Dactyl Hill Squad by Daniel Jose Older. I actually want to continue this series soon. But this is an alternate history American Civil War story. The alternate history part comes in because we have dinosaurs, but this is not like a cute and whimsical and happy story. I mean, there are a lot of moments of humor and lightness, and the friendships in this book are just really wonderful, but overall this is a story about racism and colorism and oppression in a lot of different ways. And this is another book that kind of surprised me with how dark it was, because in the first couple of chapters, the main characters, these young kids, witness a lynching, and it's horrifying, and like, unfortunately that is realistic. Like, kids grew up seeing that. But despite all of the heavy parts, I think there is enough hope to keep you going, and it's just really a delight to see Magdalena, our main character, start to make friends and start to bond with the dinosaurs that she is writing. She also is trying to find out what happened to her brother, so she has kind of that personal conflict going on as well. She's so brave and smart and very selfless in ways that I don't think I could have been at her age. Definitely recommend that one. Okay, just a couple more categories, you guys. Another reason I've heard from people is that they just can't connect with what the characters are going through. That these middle grade protagonists are just too far removed, and that they don't really have any interest in their problems, or they don't feel any connection or similarity in their problems. And I think a good way to combat this one is to look for books that do kind of bridge that middle grade into YA age range. I mean, personally, I think that you should be able to connect with characters who are not exactly like yourself, but when you're just getting started, it might be a good idea to look for those bridge books. I mentioned the Time series already. That is a great one for this that I already talked about. And Frances Hardinge, who I talked about at the very beginning, she's also really great for this because her books are so like inconsistently categorized, which might be one of the reasons I enjoy them, because they have all of these different aspects to them. But for example, one of the things I've always really appreciated about her books are that the adults feel like fully developed characters that are just as present and important as the kids. Like, you might not be following them as much, but they're not just written off as like plot devices to get the kids to where they need to be. And that's something I sometimes feel with certain middle grade books, or I feel like adult books do this a lot of time with kids. Like, they just treat them as like tropes or plot devices or something. And Frances Hardinge and a lot of really talented middle grade writers are great at making all ages of the characters feel important. I also want to mention Witchwood by Tahereh Mafi. This is a companion sequel to Furthermore, and Furthermore is very much, I think, what people assume all middle grade is like. It's a very whimsical fantasy that I really enjoyed. But even though Witchwood is a companion book, it's very, very different to me. You can also read this as a standalone, by the way. You follow a couple of the same characters from Furthermore, but the story is completely different. The atmosphere is even different. Like, everything about this book, down to the setting and everything, is very different from Furthermore. And I think this one would appeal more to a wide range of readers. And another reason it's in this category is because I think the main character, I think her age is a little older, and there is a very small romantic subplot in this book. That's another kind of similar reason that I've heard from people, is they really like romance, and middle grade doesn't have romance. I think when it's done badly, it can feel super uncomfortable, but there are some authors who are good at showing how, like, friendships or connections, how you could see how that would turn romantic later. I don't want to get into the like shipping children discussion, because that's just not something we need to do right now. But when it's done in a certain way, I think it can be an added layer to a book, and I think Witchwood does that really well. Another one that does that well is Mary Haskell's books. I don't think any of the 3 books I've read from her, I don't think any of them feature a romance with the main character, but they all have really deep friendships with other characters that I think you could see them turning romantic later, to the extent that on her frequently asked questions page on her website, she actually addresses like if some of them ever turned romantic later, which I think is kind of funny. And another reason that her books are in this category is because her books are like kind of historical fantasy. Like, the setting is very loosely based on a real time period, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying with the older time periods and historical fiction, like characters who are young feeling older. I think that's another reason why her books might have more crossover appeal, because the characters in them are young, but because they grew up in a certain time period, they're basically treated like adults by the time they're like 13 or something. Also, she just has really, really wonderful stories. I think The Princess Curse and The Castle Behind Thorns are my favorite of hers, but the Handbook for Dragon Slayers is also wonderful. Another great one for this category is Marisi by Maria Turchaninov, translated by A.A. Prime. I have talked many times about this series, but I feel like this is a perfect series to talk about for people looking to get into middle grade, because the entire series spans multiple age ranges. Marisi, the first book, is middle grade, I would say, even though it handles really serious topics like honor killings and misogyny. And then the second book, Nandel, is actually a prequel, and that one is definitely adult. It is really, really upsetting and hard to read at times, but definitely very well told and important. And then the third book, Red Mantle, which was actually one of my favorite books of last year. That one feels like it could be between YA and adult. So I just love the fact that this series spans all the age ranges. But that might be a really great way for you to get into middle grade, is if you kind of get attached to the characters and follow them as they age. That might be a nice way to kind of get around that. And I won't go into too much of a summary for the Marisi books because I have talked about them quite a bit, and I do want to do a full review for them at some point. But wonderful character development and female friendships. The magic is fascinating, and how the magic and the culture and the religious systems kind of intertwine. Like, it's a very female-centric religious system, which I find super interesting to read about, so definitely recommend that series. Then the last one in this category is Beastkeeper by Kat Hellison, which is a middle grade Beauty and the Beast retelling, which I think is another thing people might not know that middle grade can do. But this is a very strange book, and it's a hard one to recommend to people, but I think if you're really into dark, weird fairy tales, you might like this. And one of the takeaways of this book is about how love is important and it changes things, but also how it doesn't always fix everything. And I think that and some of the other thematic elements of this book make it feel like it does have appeal to not just middle grade readers. The writing of this one is also something that I think would not be what people tend to associate with middle grade. I actually talked about this one at length in a Beauty and the Beast recommendations video, so I will link that down below. But I think that one's like a really great crossover book because the characters are middle grade range, but some of the themes are more adult, and some of the actual storytelling plot points feel more young adult, or at least what people tend to associate with those things. And finally, the very last reason I'm going to talk about that I hear people give sometimes is that they just haven't found anything besides Harry Potter that they enjoy, like any middle grade that gives them that feeling. And in general, I'm not a huge fan of comparing a book to another book in order to recommend it, but I do want to shout out a few series that I think have some similarities with Harry Potter that might interest people. First off, I want to mention, it's kind of an honorable mention, I know that people say the Nevermore books feel like they gave them the feeling that Harry Potter did. I've only read the first one and I enjoyed it, but I didn't feel like that, so I'm not actually going to talk about that one officially, but know that that is a recommendation from other people. The first one I want to talk about is Keeper of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. I've only read the first two books, but I'm really enjoying that series so far. And the reason I think this is a little bit like Harry Potter, it's a magical school setting. There's a wide cast of secondary characters that you really get to know, which I'm really enjoying. There's also a little bit of a chosen one trope, but it's not done in a way that I find irritating, which is nice. And also that there's a good balance of the fun stuff and the serious saving the world stuff. I've also heard that as the books go on, like later in the series, that you start seeing even more serious consequences, which I think is kind of how the Harry Potter books went too. So I think that might be a good one to check out. Also, another personal favorite series of mine is Charlie Bone, the Chronicles of the Red King, I think is the name of the series. Children of the Red King. I don't remember the official name, by Jenny Nimmo. I loved those books. I still love those books. And I think they are the unfortunate recipient of that Harry Potter comparison, because I think a lot of people wrote them off as a knockoff, and actually, despite some like surface level similarities in terms of like the setup or the tropes, I don't think they're very similar at all. But I do want to mention them in this category because this is another one that has a magical school, but it's like if Hogwarts were evil. Like Bloor's Academy is like the school for the gifted and everything, and it's like really creepy, and a lot of the people involved with it are really evil, not good people. And even from the first book, you see that like they are willing to hurt children, which is not a thing that you enjoy, but I think this has like a similar tone to Harry Potter and those middle grade series where it's like you see that the villains are not going to cut the main characters slack just because they're kids. I think that's one of the things, it sounds like that's one of the things that people enjoy about Harry Potter and about more like serious middle grade. So I do want to mention that. And again, with the wide cast of characters who are really fun to get to know, who have really well developed personalities and arcs. And also Charlie himself he reminds me just a tiny bit of Harry. Like, I feel like they'd get along because they're both just like good people who are trying to do the right thing and who are like a little bewildered by this magical world that they're thrown into. But I just love that series. It's not one I recommend to everybody because, again, I think it did suffer for the Harry Potter comparison quite a bit. But if you like the magic powers thing, if you like the idea of like a creepy school, and I also feel like the series did a really great job of showing like the responsibility that these kids feel. Like, they know that they're kids and that they shouldn't have to worry about this stuff, but they also feel that pressure to kind of balance the school. I just think it's really interesting seeing how they recognize that responsibility and they are very selfless about accepting it, but they also still feel like kids or young teenagers. That's another thing, is I think the kids are slightly older than some of the other middle grade series, so that might also be a bonus for you. And then the last one is one of my favorite series of all time, which is no surprise, I'm sure, and that is the Artemis Fowl books by Owen Colfer. And this one I think is much less connected to Harry Potter, but I wanted to mention it because you grow up with Artemis throughout the books like you do with Harry, and I think that's something that a lot of people really enjoyed about Harry Potter, and that's something that the Artemis Fowl books do. And his character arc is just wonderful. Like, he honestly, Artemis's character arc set the standard for me with like villain redemption stories or just like protagonist character arcs in general. Like, I know a lot of people said that Zuko's character arc was like the crowning glory for them, which I didn't grow up watching Avatar: The Last Airbender. I have seen it now and it's wonderful and I love it and I love Zuko, but Artemis Fowl was like my Zuko, if that makes sense. Like, seeing his arc just like was so well done and so important to me. And this series is a really interesting blend of science fiction and fantasy. So I think if you are intrigued by that, this might be a really fun one for you. Like, there's fairies and magical creatures, but they have like ray guns and blasters and technology, which is really cool, and I really liked seeing how those things mixed. We did the whole Artemis Fowl read-along last year. This is another one that I find it hard to recommend to people because it is so important to me, and I understand why people might not have as deep a connection that I did with it, but I did want to mention it in this category because of the like growing up with the characters kind of thing. Okay everybody, I'm sure that was a marathon of a video, but if you are still here, thank you so much for watching. I hope that if you or somebody you know has been kind of like writing off middle grade, or maybe you are trying to get into it but you just don't know where to start, I hope this has helped out a little bit. Like I said at the beginning, I don't think it's people just deciding they're too good for middle grade books. I think a lot of it is down to publishers and kind of marketing and trying to like target their demographic very specifically. I think that ends up making people feel like books are not for them, you know? So I hope that this combated that a little bit. Let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick any of them up. And let me know if you know of other reasons or excuses people have given for why they're, you know, they just don't want to read middle grade books. Middle grade has never worked for them and never will work for them. If you have other reasons that you've heard from people, leave those in the comments too, and maybe I'll do a part 2 for this if anyone is interested. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!